Hey guys, welcome to the ninth video in this Flame game development series where we are making Ski Master, a top-down vertical scroller about skiing. In the last video, we added a nice fade transition at the start and end of each level, and we also added some extra trail at both the ends to avoid showing any empty spaces through the camera. So in this video, I'm going to focus on calculating the score and displaying it on the screen. And to be specific, the score will essentially represent the number of snowmen collected by the player. So let's get started. First, to store the number of snowmen collected, let's add a private integer in the gameplay class. I'll name this as nsnowmen collected. Now, to keep this number updated, we need to know when the player hits a snowman. And if you remember, we already get this information in the onCollision start of the player class. But on a second thought, I think it will be much better if we let the snowman handle this collision instead of the player class. So I'll remove the onCollision start method and the collision callbacks mixin from this class, and I'll add them in the snowman class. Here, I'll just check if the other component is of type player, and if it is, I'll invoke the collect method. And since collect is now only called from this class, we can convert it into a private method. Next, to allow external code to know when the snowman is collected, I'll expose an optional callback called onCollected from this class. And I'll invoke this callback from the collect method. Now back in handle spawn point method of gameplay class, while spawning the snowman objects, we can set a custom callback for onCollected. So I'll create a new private method here called onSnowmanCollected, where I'll just increase the nSnowmanCollected count by 1. And now this method can be set as the onCollected callback for all the snowman objects. With this, we now have a running count of number of snowmen collected by the player. Next, let's create a simple HUD component to display this count on the screen. Basically, I want a snowman sprite with a number next to it at the bottom right corner of the screen at all times. So I'll start by creating a new file in game folder called hud.dart. In this file, I'll create a new class called HUD, extending the component class. To make this HUD remain static with respect to the camera, we'll be adding it to the viewport of the camera. And to enforce this relationship, I'll add the parent as a mixin to this class with viewport as the generic parameter. This makes sure that any object of this class is only ever added to an object of viewport class. Then next, let's add a text component member in this class called count. This will be responsible for displaying the count of snowmen, and initially it will display 0. I'll set its anchor to center left and text renderer to text paint with color as black and font size as 10. Next, to display the snowman sprite, I'll add a final sprite component member called snowman. To initialize this, we'll need a sprite, which I'll add as a required parameter to the HUD constructor. Using this sprite, I'll initialize the sprite component and I'll also set its anchor to anchor.center. Next, to place the text and sprite component at the bottom right corner, I'll override the onload method of this class. In here, using the virtual size of parent viewport, I'll update the position of sprite component such that it is placed at 35 units from the right edge and 20 units from the bottom edge. To keep things relative, I'll place the text component using the position of snowman component with a small x offset. Finally, let's add both these components as children of HUD. And remember, this is just one way of laying out the HUD components. You can achieve the same layout using a lot of different combinations of anchor and position values. Okay, now to see this in action, let's go back to gameplay class and add a late final member of HUD here. I'll initialize this component in the onload method after creating the feeder component. But to do that, we need to provide the snowman sprite as input. We already have the code to get that snowman sprite from the sprite sheet in the handle spawn points method. So to keep things organized, I'll move out the sprite sheet creation code to the onload method just after the TMX file has been loaded. To access this sprite sheet from anywhere in the class, I'll convert it into a private late final member. And now all the sprites can be fetched from this single sprite sheet, including the snowman sprite input to our HUD component. And finally, I'll add HUD to the camera's viewport along with the fader component. Now let's test this in the game. Okay, and as you can see, the snowman sprite and the text component are displayed at the bottom right. Also, it remains static with respect to the camera because the HUD is added as child of viewport. But you might notice that the HUD component is rendered on top of fader component. This happens because of the order in which these components are added to their parent. So if we first add the HUD component and then add fader component to the viewport, this should be fixed. But we can also increase the priority of the fader component to a higher value to make it render above all of its sibling components. By default, most components are added with a priority of 0. So I'll set the priority of fader to 1. And yes, as you can see, now the HUD gets rendered behind the fader component. Okay, now to make the text component on the HUD update along with the snowman count, I'll add a new public method in HUD class called update snowman count. This method will take the current count as input and will update the text on the HUD with that value. And to actually make this work, I'll go back to the onSnowmanCollected method of gameplay class and invoke update snowman count on the HUD with the updated value of nSnowmanCollected. Now let's quickly test this in the game. Yep, and as you can see, the count does update on the HUD when the player collects a snowman. Now, although this is functional, it is not very noticeable. Player can very easily miss to notice that the score gets updated. To bring players' attention to the score update and to make the HUD feel more alive, I'll add some simple effects to the sprite and text in the update snowman count method. In game development, this is often referred to as game juice or game feel. Basically, anything that does not affect the gameplay directly but makes the game feel satisfying and alive is known as game juice. Okay, now let's test this in the game. And as you can see, now the sprite and text component animate a bit when the score updates. If needed, we might do a second pass on this effect, but for now, this should be good enough. So yeah, that was it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit that like button, consider subscribing to show your support, and I'll see you in the next one.